Good evening. The United Nations 26th Conference of the Parties, COP26, of the Framework Convention on Climate Change continues in Glasgow, Scotland through Friday, November 12. Proponents hope it will result in stringent, enforceable limits on carbon dioxide emissions, limits that will effectively eliminate fossil fuels as energy sources. Skeptics expect it will produce nothing more than virtue signaling with unenforceable commitments, quote unquote, from some nations and complete refusal to comply from others, especially China and India, which together have nearly a quarter of the world's population, actually over a quarter. Climate scientist Vijay Jayaraj joins us from Bengaluru, India, what many people in the West know still as Bangalore, this evening to discuss COP26. He brings a perspective quite different from what dominates in Western countries. In a moment, I'll introduce Vijay to you, a dear friend of mine, stretching back over a decade now. But first, I would like to just inform you about a free book that we're offering to anyone who is interested in receiving it, as our way of saying thank you for a gift of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance. The book is Recovering the Constitution by using the Ninth Amendment to restore civil liberty. This is by my friend David Fowler, who is an attorney and the president of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. He's also a former Tennessee state legislator, state senator, and a wonderful Christian man. And in this book, David argues that the many, many Supreme Court rulings that have been treated as if they somehow removed from the law books laws passed by the legislatures of various states haven't actually done that. And that there is a way, using the Ninth Amendment, for states to go ahead and implement those laws, despite the fact that sometime or other the US Supreme Court ruled them invalid. This is a fascinating book, and granted the threats to liberty by an ever-expanding federal government, I think it's crucially important that our state governments recover their strength, their ability to do as they please, as their people please, expressed through their elected representatives. So, if you would like to receive a free copy of Recovering the Constitution, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form that will come up then, when you get to the comments field, simply write in either promo code 21-11 or the book's title, Recovering the Constitution, and we will be glad to send you a free copy of it. 100% of your gift will be tax deductible. Well, again, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our good friend Vijay Jayaraj. Vijay earned his Master's in Science in Environmental Science at the University of East Anglia in England. Some of you may remember having heard of the University of East Anglia for a couple of different reasons. One, it is the home of what is called the Climatic Research Unit, or the Climate Research Unit. This is one of the central places at which research is done on climate change under the auspices of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Vijay did his work there in the 2000s and was there at the time that another thing you might have heard of took place, and that was ClimateGate. In November of 2009, just before that year's Global Climate Summit, similar to what's going on right now in Glasgow, someone managed to put up onto the internet thousands of emails and a lot of computer code used by the climate scientists at the Climatic Research Unit, but also at various other research centers around the world, especially in the United States, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, And Michael Mann, the primary author of what became known infamously as the hockey stick global temperature graph, a graph that eventually was thoroughly debunked by accomplished statisticians who showed that Mann had misused statistical methodology, had used very inadequate data points, and had essentially erased the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, even though a couple of thousand years of history, as well as a great deal of natural field evidence in the way of tree rings and uh, uh, ice core samples, things like that, stalactites and stalagmites in caves. Great deal of evidence showed the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age were real. The hockey stick graph seemed to just erase that from history. Later on, although the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change used the hockey stick graph repeatedly in its 2001 assessment report, it disappeared from later assessment reports. And it's clear that that was wrong. At any rate, what was fascinating about the emails released in ClimateGate was that they showed these researchers at these various different places, how shall we put it, um, suppressing contrary data, intimidating researchers who had other opinions from their own, influencing journal editors not to publish articles that contradicted or even questioned the claim of catastrophic anthropogenic climate change, that they fabricated data, that they suppressed data, they refused to share data with other scientists who would then be able to test and see if they could replicate the findings of these researchers. It was quite a scandal, one of the greatest scandals in the history of science. And Vijay was right there at the University of East Anglia at the time that this happened. That was one of the things that began opening his eyes to the tremendous problems in the idea of dangerous man-made global warming. And not too long after that, he got in touch with us at the Cornwall Alliance, and we've had a wonderful relationship ever since then. He writes frequently for us on our blog and in articles that we manage to place in a number of other venues. It's just great to have Vijay on the team. He's also more recently become a research assistant for another organization, the CO2 Coalition, which exists for the purpose of telling the world that carbon dioxide is a very good thing, that having more of it in the atmosphere is very good for all the plants around the world, and therefore for everything that eats anything that comes from plants. That includes people, and the ones who benefit the most are the world's poor. Vijay is now writing very frequently for the CO2 Coalition. You can see his work and that of others at co2coalition.org. And we're delighted to be able to have a teamwork relationship with CO2 Coalition and Vijay Jayaraj. So let's welcome Vijay. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Vijay, uh, we're going to show a clip of an interview that you did with GB News just recently about the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. But before we do that, just quickly tell our viewers about yourself, where you came from, how you got into the work that you do. And of course, you also did postgraduate studies in climate science at the University of uh, no, Victoria? No. Uh,
British Columbia.
British Columbia, right. You did
Yes.
graduate work there. So tell us a bit about yourself, and then we'll move on to see that clip.
Yeah. Thanks, Cal, for having me again on your show. It's a great pleasure to discuss on the recent developments with regard to climate policies across the globe. Well, my name is Vijay. I'm originally from India, but my interests in environmental issues led me to study my master's in environmental sciences from the University of East Anglia in UK in the year 2010. And it was the same year when the ClimateGate scandal hit the world, and a lot of controversies began emerging regarding climate change, and it caused a natural interest and curiosity in me to find out the diverse set of opinions that exist among scientists. And it is one of the reasons why I became a climate realist, one who's neither denies climate change nor promotes climate fear. So it is at that point when I got in touch with Cornwall Alliance, and uh, their objective to promote balanced environmental action where humans steward uh, the nature, at the same time look after the well-being of the society, was a really attractive objective for me, because I tend to see a lot of radical environmental policies in countries like India. So that set me into motion of working more and more close together with organizations like the Cornwall Alliance. Yeah, and more recently, I worked with the University of British Columbia in Canada as a research assistant in one of their research teams as a part of my graduate study there. And after that, I worked with a couple of energy firms in New Delhi, India. Post which I began writing on climate and energy and the need for development among the world's poorest. Yeah, so that's basically my short bio.
Yeah, and Vijay is also a very committed Christian. He's spent a lot of time in his life uh, taking the gospel to others and helping to show the reasons for Christian faith. He's studied a great deal of apologetics, so that's another common interest that he and I have, a common calling that we have. Well, right now, because the Global Climate Summit is underway in Glasgow, GB News in Great Britain contacted Vijay and asked him to do an interview with them about it. And so we'd like to show you that interview right now.
Vijay Jayaraj, who is joining us there, he is being part of this overall discussion, aren't you, Vijay, about what is being talked about here in Glasgow, Research Associate for Developing Countries at the Cornwall Alliance. What did you make of what you've seen here in Glasgow over the last 2 or 3 days from where you are?
Yeah, well, the Chancellor announced that he's pledging money, and he pointed out that while Paris was a promise, today in Glasgow is an action where they are actually putting that on paper. But leaders in India, the Prime Minister and the ministers have been telling the COP and the Paris Agreement that the pledged money has not arrived and there's been only talks. So even today's promises, we have to wait and see whether they are actually following up that promises with actual funding. But having said that, I would like to remind some of the viewers that though India is installing a huge amount of renewables and they are getting funded from the COP for that, they are also simultaneously increasing their fossil fuel dependency. And for instance, the very day when India's Prime Minister pledged net zero by 2070, the very day back in India, the coal minister pledged that the coal ministry would increase the coal production up to 1 billion tons 2024 from the current 700 million tons. So the reality of energy needs over here in India is quite different. And my analysis is that both India and China, they are playing a twin strategy where they install more and more renewables, but at the same time they are doing a fossil fuel increase.
In saying that, Vijay, lots of people here were quite harsh or sceptical about Narendra Modi's announcement on Monday that India would only become carbon neutral by 2070. But actually, and I think India contributes 7% of global emissions when it comes to greenhouse gases. China's way out in front on that. But when it comes down to a proportion by population, what the average Indian contributes compared to the average British person, we're still way ahead.
Yeah, you're right, because the global average is around 4.5 tons per person, and India's is less than half of the global average, and the UK is slightly above the global average, and if you look at the US, they are way above, and likewise with China. So the argument from India is that the per capita emission is way below the global average, and it would be immoral and unethical for Western countries to pressurize the same kind of pressure that we heard from some of the speakers today about pressurizing financial companies and pressurizing governments and leaders to act upon climate. But in a country like India, when you disrupt the fossil fuel the fossil fuel chain, you will end up in widespread chaos. And we saw that in India last month when our coal inventories went short. A lot of states had blackouts and a few announced load shedding as well. So the reality here is not just an increase in, yeah.
Sorry, Vijay, sorry to cut across you there. I was just going to say, just finally on this, we do focus an awful lot on actually the contribution to greenhouse gases and the overall effect on global warming. But another big issue that is clearly linked to the emissions from factories and cars and electricity and coal and all that sort of stuff is pollution, which is a major issue in big Indian cities like Bangalore, like in Delhi and elsewhere. How much is public opinion, I'm trying to say, how much is public opinion playing into the national narrative in India when it comes to tackling climate change pollution?
Yeah, I mean, India is one of the most polluted countries. In our northern belt, there are a couple of cities which consistently rank among the top 5 in the world for pollution. But pollution from the coal plants and the vehicles are not the only reasons. So one of the main reasons for India being high on the pollution ranking is stubble burning by agriculturists during a certain months of the year. So what happens is that, along with the topography of the northern plains, causes a huge pollution levels among a lot of cities in the north. So to answer your question, when it comes to public consensus, I think the media controls the narrative all over the globe, and it's the same over here in India. And they shamelessly blame the coal plants and the vehicles for that, whereas it's a mix of various reasons. And moreover, India has demanded that all of its coal plants install filters to reduce the emittance from the plants. So that will be in place, and by 2024, all our coal plants will have filters.
Okay, Vijay, thank you very much indeed for joining us there from Bangalore. That's Vijay Jayaraj, who is...
Ladies.
Well, first off, congratulations, Vijay. I think it's quite an indication of the respect that the media there have for you, that they had you on that program. There are so many different things that you touched on there that we could start talking about. Let's start with the last one, and that is there is always the complaint that particularly coal-fired power plants can be pretty badly polluting. They can put out a lot of soot, a lot of noxious gases, toxic gases, sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides, and the like. And so therefore, there seems to be the impression that a coal-fired plant is by necessity always going to be filthy and result in very badly polluted air that really harms people's health. You indicated that there are reasons why that isn't necessarily the case, why coal-fired plants can be operated in a very clean manner. What are those?
Yeah, there are a number of things that we can touch upon when it comes to coal plants and pollution. The first point is that developed countries across the globe right now employ clean coal technology, where the emissions, not by emissions I mean the pollutants from burning coal, is considerably less than what it used to be. And Japan is a big proponent of clean coal technology. So that has to be kept in mind. So, but when it comes to countries like India, uh, there have been very clear and very focused policies that have ensured that within a couple of years, all the coal plants in India would have filters that reduce the emissions. So it's not a case where countries like India are turning a blind eye to the emissions from coal plants. Nevertheless, it is important to remember that coal plants by themselves do not have the power or the uh, kind of impact that the media is portraying it to be, portraying them to be. So for instance, we have a lot of cities and towns across India. India is a vast country, which have a very good air quality index throughout the year, despite being not
Hmm.
far from coal plants. So the fact that coal plants have somehow been linked to both CO2 emissions and to pollution is nothing but a clear strategy uh, to make people perceive these as evil technologies, technologies that are
Hmm.
outdated. Whereas people should understand, even advanced countries, countries that take pollution very seriously, like Japan, are employing clean coal technology. And in fact, uh, as a result of the fallout of Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan, the country went totally uh, nuclear free. And during this time, during the past 1 decade, they've been reliant on coal technology, and everyone knows that they are the number one exporter of clean coal technology. So the notion that coal plants are dirty and they cause a lot of pollution is a false one. We've come to a stage where even developing countries are able to employ clean coal technology in their new coal plants. India, for example, has more than 30 coal plants under construction, and still a lot of plants are in line for approval. China has more than 100 coal plants. And so the notion is wrong. And if I might add, the causes for pollution in India is quite diverse. As I touched upon in that news clip, for instance, uh, in the city of Delhi, which is notorious for its high ranking in the air quality index across the globe, like it always features in the top five when it comes to bad air quality. We are talking about particulate matters like uh, zero point 0.5, and we are talking about nitrous dioxide. And so what happens with the city like Delhi is that it's surrounded by industries, and there are coal plants outside the state. But the main reason is stubble burning by farmers in the neighboring states of Punjab and Haryana, and this makes the air quality worse during the months of November, which is also the season when the winter sets in. So the dirty air gets trapped, and you also have Delhi and a few other cities on what we call the Gangetic Plain, which has the Himalayan ranges up north, blocking the pollution again. So it's a number of factors that contributes to Delhi's pollution. We specifically talk about Delhi because it has 30 million people in a single city and its satellite cities together, and it constantly features in the global top 5 or 10. So even in there, the problem is not necessarily coal plants or the vehicular emissions. It's more to do with other factors. So
Hmm.
the case of pollution in countries like India is a complex one, and it would be unfair to just associate coal plants with pollution.
You used a particularly, I think, key phrase in the midst of what you were saying there. You said, even developing countries are now beginning to be able to use clean coal plants, that is, coal fired power plants that have scrubbers or filters on their stacks so that essentially none of the actually harmful emissions come out. In fact, from the really advanced clean coal plants around the developed world, the only thing that's actually coming out of their cooling towers is a combination of water vapor and carbon dioxide. And water vapor, of course, turns to clouds and comes down in rain, and that's a good thing. And carbon dioxide feeds plants all over the world so that the planet is greening and so that there is more food available for everything that eats plants or eats something that does eat plants. But what I was particularly struck by was you're saying even developing countries are now beginning to be able to use that. And that way of putting it um, sort of should alert people to the fact that clean coal burning plants are more expensive than dirty coal burning plants. The scrubbers, the filters, they cost a good bit. They're very expensive. And it is only as countries get wealthy enough that they can afford that. But before that, the electricity that comes from even the dirtiest coal-fired power plants brings far more benefit to the surrounding population, the users of that electricity, than the harms from the pollution that comes out in the making of that electricity. And that's made clear by the fact that that life expectancy rises in those areas at the very same time that the dirty coal plants multiply. So what's crucial in cleaning up the atmosphere, in preventing that pollution, is achieving high enough levels of economic development, high enough levels of prosperity to be able to afford the more technologically sophisticated and expensive means of making electricity through the use of coal. And that's a fundamental lesson that the Cornwall Alliance has been trying to get across to people for a long time. Sometimes we put it this way: a clean, healthful, beautiful environment is a costly good, and wealthier people can afford more costly goods than poorer people can. So as we look at COP26, this conference of the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change under the United Nations, uh, they're considering a variety of different policies. They're trying to get governments to make hard and fast and enforceable commitments to reduce their emissions of CO2 from various different sources, whether it's power plants or cement making or whatever else. They're trying to get countries all over the world to make these commitments, and yet they're not taking into consideration adequately the importance of economic development in the poorer countries of the world to enable their people to afford a cleaner, healthier environment around themselves. Talk to us a bit, Vijay, about some of your concerns as an Indian who's also lived in the West, studied in the West. You've seen both sides of the coin between poverty and prosperity. What are your concerns as an Indian about the matters that are transpiring now in Glasgow at COP26?
Yeah, thanks for raising that question. Well, I would say that ever since the Paris Agreement came into uh, practice since 2016, uh, I've noticed that there has been very little importance given to economic development in the developing parts of the world. So the only reason they talk about energy transition and for people not being able to keep up with the pace of uh, transition that is demanded from international agreements from Paris, the only reason they mention this and talk about this is as to see how fast the transition can happen, and not because they want to really help people have energy access and to prioritize the energy needs. So that has been the attitude right from the beginning in 2016. So the COP conference, which happens every year, and it's organized by the United Nations, the Conference of Parties, and this year it's the 26th edition, happening in Glasgow, and So it has been just similar to the previous COPs since 2016. It's always been about the Paris Agreement and emission reduction all across the globe, specifically greenhouse gases. And this year, the focus has shifted more towards the net zero policy. So a year ago, there was talks about the focus shifting towards net zero, and this year at the COP, they made sure that net zero takes prominence. You hear very little about the Paris Agreement. Until last year, it used to be as per the Paris Convention, we are pledging to reduce emissions. We are funding developing countries with green fund. But this year, the language has been about individual commitments from different governments. More or less, they are looking at a global net zero commitment by 2050, although some countries have objected to it. So the answer to your question would be that yes, it's a big matter of concern. For instance, when we go back to our previous topic, pollution, even before the clean coal technology came about in the last decade or so, developed economies were still cleaner when it comes to air pollution, water pollution, land pollution. The developed countries were far ahead of developing countries, and this was explained very well by the Kuznets curve, a bell-shaped curve that explains why when the economies develop and they get to the top, their air pollution tends to decrease, and so that is very well observed in some of the major economies. For instance, the UK and the US were the heart of industrial revolution for humanity, and you can see. As a person from a developing country, I can see how much better the environment is out there, and it's precisely because these are developed economies able to spend more of the investment on cleaning up the environment, and they can afford to uh, invest more in cleaning up the environment, whereas countries like India, China are at a stage where uh, people are still in poverty, and it takes a long time before we reach the point in the curve where our pollution begins to decrease. But if we stop developing at this stage, then reducing pollution would be like an unanswerable question, because there's a perpetual poverty and a perpetual need for prioritizing funding in other areas rather than putting them into environmental cleaning and environmental welfare. So developing countries right now face this choice between uh, empowering their economy more and more so that they could become self-reliant and clean up the environment against the pressure from the Western Bloc, who are leading the Global Climate Pact, for asking these countries to slow down their economic growth, because what happens is when you disrupt the energy sector, and the energy sector globally has been dependent predominantly on the fossil fuels. So when you disrupt this energy sector, it slows down the economy in all parts of the world, and we saw that even in developed nations where uh, prioritizing renewables led to a bit of chaos when it comes to both energy access and energy affordability. So this is a tricky situation that developing countries are in, and I would say it's unfair because as a person from a developing country, when I look at the Western countries, they had their fair share of uh, resource utilization when it comes to fossil fuels, and they were able to develop to a stage where now they can even afford to ask entire states to implement strict uh, emission policies, and still people can be well off. So but you cannot think about the same in developing countries, or even in some parts of developed countries where it gets really tricky when you force people to compromise on growth in the name of cutting down emissions.
Right. Now, just about a week ago, actually November 3rd, you published a new article on the website of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, cornwallalliance.org/blog, called COP26 at Odds with Leaders of Nearly 40% of World's People Likely to Fail. And I'd like to just read just a bit of the introduction to that, because I'd like you to comment on it and expand on it. You started off by saying that India alone is a huge thorn in the sides of the Glasgow glitterati. COP26, the current global gala gathering of climate elite, appears headed for a grand failure as key countries making up nearly 40% of the world's population either spurn the meeting outright or act on the realities of their own circumstances. India has demanded from developed countries $100 billion a year in aid to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, as well as compensation for what it's calling loss and damage from climate change, while refusing to end its own use of coal. The impractical funding demands and categorical rejection of a coal phase out come on the heels of Russia's and China's refusal to participate in the conference at Glasgow, where climate alarmists are expected to promote replacement of fossil fuels with so-called green energy. That objective now is apparently divergent from the interests of three nations that are the homes of 2.9 billion of the world's 7.8 billion people. So tell us, why is it that roughly 40% of the world's population is the nations where they live are so resistant to what the architects of COP26, of the whole framework convention on climate change, are after? Why these particular nations?
Yeah, Cal, like I would like to stay very practical in my answer to that question, because I realized more and more that there could be theories and there could be strategies devised at the
Mhm.
COP meetings, but the reality of energy need in developing countries is totally different. So if I were a minister in charge of generating enough electricity, excuse me, for a country like India, where 1.3 billion people live, and likewise in China, where another 1.3 billion people live. So if I were a minister, I would be focusing on strategies to secure enough resources to guarantee uninterrupted energy supply to nearly 2.6 billion people. So the only way that I can do that is through fossil fuels, because as you know, both wind and solar are unreliable sources of energy. The moment wind stops and solar stops, uh, for ho- for instance, we saw a similar situation in Germany over a number of days last month, when both wind and solar completely went off, and the country had to rely on fossil fuels. So, in such situations, it would be extremely difficult to provide energy for 2.6 billion. And China experienced that this year and continues to experience, where more than 17 provinces face unprecedented blackouts with industries shut and excuse me, and companies closed, and people are on unpaid leave for a month or so, because the local government has asked companies that to shut down, as they cannot guarantee electricity supply. So this is the nature of energy reality in these countries, and they cannot back off from their dependency on fossil fuels. And this is the reason why they are unwilling to commit to net zero by 2050. And China has said that it might commit, but we are still unsure, because China has not been giving a proper report of its emissions since 2014. So that's where China is headed. And when it comes to India, India is very clear that it will not compromise on its coal intake. For instance, a couple of days ago at Glasgow, uh, all major countries, more than 180 countries, pledged to end coal, except for three major countries, which is US, China, and India. And the reason is the same that I explained a while back, which is it's literally impossible to cut down on coal when more than 70% of all electricity in both India and China depend on coal, and a majority of their people depend on oil and gas as well for cooking and transportation needs. And it's a nightmare for these countries to even think about ending coal. And so this is why people need to know the finer details of the Paris Agreement and even the net zero commitment. If you look at the Paris Agreement, India has categorically mentioned that in its commitment to reduce emissions, it will not compromise on coal consumption or production. And it has even stated that even when it comes to emissions, when there is a need for its energy sector to function in a more aggressive way, it will compromise on its commitments to reduce emissions. So,
Yeah.
likewise, China has been uh, acting in a very contradicting way when it comes to its promises, because it is actively involved in construction of coal plants across Asia and Africa, and even drilling of oil and gas wells across continents. So these nations are defying one of the primary percept of the global action against climate change. And this is because of the reality of energy needs in these countries. And we could keep on talking about that, but one of the key things to remember is that uh, these countries have a twin policy of installing more and more renewables. For instance, India leads the International Solar Alliance along with France, and now it has a new tie-up with UK, and it's installing tremendous amount of solar panels. Likewise, people might have seen pictures of the solar farms in China and the wind farms in China. But these countries simultaneously develop their fossil fuel sector. Uh, just a couple of days ago, China has asked all its coal mines, to produce as much coal as possible. Likewise, India's coal minister this week has asked its coal sector to devise new strategies to increase its coal production by 30% from the current 700 million to 1 billion tons by 2023, as early as 2023. So this is the reality in these countries, and something that is not showcased on the mainstream media, and which doesn't even have airtime even in news channels that uh, appear to be defending the use of fossil fuels. So so that is my answer to your question, that the reality of energy need forces these countries to not give in to the pressure from Glasgow and Paris.
Yeah. Yeah. Just
Yeah,
simply the physics realities, the engineering realities, the economic
yeah,
realities about energy production from fossil fuels versus from wind and solar and other so-called renewables. All of those realities are going to gang up on the hopes of the whole COP process, the Conference of the Parties process, um, which is why I'm just convinced that net zero in 2050 for some countries, 2070 for other countries, it's simply not going to happen. They are not going to balance out their carbon dioxide emissions with their uh, sequestering of carbon dioxide. They're not going to wind up no longer adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and that's just basic reality. Um, excuse me. Um, uh, one of the things that has always puzzled me too, Vijay, is just the notion that that negotiators at a UN conference today are going to bind the parliaments or the congresses of their countries 20, 30, 50 years from now. For instance, the news recently was, and I'm sure you know this, that India has said, well, yes, we'll try to make net zero by 2070. Well, that's 49 years from now. Most of the people who are negotiating all of this will be long dead by then. New people will be in office. New technologies will have come about. Huge changes to the global economy will have come about. The economic development going on in the developing world, much more rapid than in the developed world, is going to lift many of those countries out of poverty. They're going to think very differently about international climate policy and international energy policy 10 years from now, let alone 40 or 50 years from now. So it seems rather strange to me to think that that people negotiating a treaty today are going to bind people in the future. Treaties work only so long as the countries that sign into them find it in their best interest to stick with them. As soon as those countries decide that it's no longer in their best interest to stick with them, they're going to jump out of the treaties. And that's just a simple fact of human nature. It's a simple fact of history. And so I really think that it is likely that, as you wrote, uh, the COP26 is at odds with leaders of nearly 40% of the world's people, and it is likely to fail. One thing that you mentioned to me in a bit of correspondence getting ready for this program was that you'd like to discuss pardon me, the generic claim that the world is getting worse due to climate change. That certainly is a very common idea. What's mistaken about that, Vijay?
Yeah, I'm puzzled, uh, as many of the people I know, when it comes to the question of world getting worse, because we are told that we need to act on climate, because there is a climate crisis. And when I go to, the next step, to find out what they mean by that, is that they talk about an increase in temperature, and that's a whole different topic. But what next? What does that increase in temperature mean to the world? Well, they claim that this increase in temperature will cause more extreme weather events, and by that they mean that the extreme weather events are already occurring across the globe, and these are signatures of climate change in the past number a few decades, like 50 years. So this is their claim, and this is uh, one of the main justifications for climate action, for emission reduction, and the whole climate uh, bandwagon, which talks about the dangers of climate change. So like any other curious person, began seeing data, both from people I know who've written op-eds, and by accessing official data for many of the issues that I was interested in. And what turned out to be is that this is a manufactured crisis, because there isn't a crisis in the real world. So, for instance, let's begin off with extreme weather events, one of the main justifications for climate action. So, the when it comes to the numbers, the global hurricane frequency has remained stable, and in fact, there has been a slight decrease in the frequency of global hurricanes or cyclones, however you might want to put it. But this is not uh, projected in the mainstream media. Rather, what they do is they uh, project cyclone landfalls in the way that it makes them appear catastrophic and unprecedented. People are not aware of the past, nor are they aware of the data, the raw data on global hurricanes. So it is easy to give the impression that hurricanes are increasing, and especially more devastating ones.
Yeah.
But the issue has so many layers to it. For instance, humans are now settling in more and more land area which are prone to hurricane and cyclones. So these factors are not added in, and despite that, there has been no increase in frequencies. But unfortunately, our media is so good at concealing this. Likewise, when it comes to fires in California, the historically we've had worse fires, and the fires that we've been seeing in the recent years is not uncommon. And the more important thing is that fires in California and other places have been mainly due to forest mismanagement. So you have
Yeah.
more plant or tree density within a certain area, which is very unhealthy for a forest, because it dries up the soil, and there's also more fodder for the fire to spread. So these kind of mismanagement has been
Yeah.
happening in California, and
Yeah.
it's one of the main reasons. So when it comes to floods again,
Let's,
urban floods. Yeah,
Vijay, if I may, let's make this very, very stark for our listeners. I'm going to ask you a few
okay,
questions, each of which I want you to, if you possibly can, answer with a simple yes or no. No more than that, just
okay,
yes or no,
okay.
right? Because I think so many people just are not aware of how stark these realities are. So, you've already covered hurricanes, pointing out that they're not more frequent or more powerful during the period of alleged man made global warming. Let's go to the wildfires and put that down clearly. Have wildfires become more frequent during the period of alleged man made global warming than they were, say, a century ago?
Globally, no, because humans
Yeah.
have one of the main fodder for
Okay.
wildfires is
Let's
wildlife.
let's just
I
leave
mean,
it
sorry.
just at that.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Let's
Sorry.
just leave it just at globally no. All right. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
have wildfires become larger due to global warming?
Definitely no.
Okay. Have floods become more frequent because of global warming?
No.
Have floods become more extreme because of global warming
No.
on
Purely
on
in
a
terms
global basis?
of yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No. The answer
Yeah.
is no.
Okay. Let's see. Uh, Tornadoes. Of course, the U.S. is the tornado capital of the world, but are tornadoes more frequent because of global warming?
Because of global warming, no.
No. Are tornadoes more severe, more powerful because of global warming?
No.
No. Uh, all of these answers that you've just given us stem from hard data. They are data that are available in government archives. People who are dealing with climate science, as you are, have ready access to these. This is not something that is a matter of theory. It's not a matter of different perspectives on what might happen or how the climate system works. This is a matter of observing the natural world, counting the storms, counting the fires, measuring the intensity of the storms, measuring the extent of the fires, and just recording those data. Now, we're not perfect at anything that we do, but we're a whole lot better at that than we are at hypothesizing based on our theories about climate, what might happen if we add a little more CO2 to the atmosphere. And what's really sad is that so much of the public is not aware of these just plain hard data. They think that the world is getting worse and worse, whereas in fact, and you're aware of this, of course, uh, weather-related deaths from extreme weather, have plummeted by over 98% all over the world over the last 100 years, and they're still falling. Whereas property loss is increasing because we have so much more property in the way of extreme weather events. Property loss as a percent of world gross property, let alone gross annual product, property loss as a percent is falling. And that's
Yes.
because we're getting better and better at building property that can withstand extreme weather. And it's just very, very sad to me that so many people in the public are not aware of this. And even sadder, that so many people in political leadership, in legislatures, in governors' mansions, or prime ministers, presidents, and so on, are not aware of this. They should be, and they certainly have access to the data, but they're not looking at the data very carefully. And that's what you do, and you do it very, very carefully. And that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about you. Um, you you have also looked into the issue of the environmental impact of solar and wind versus fossil fuels because of a variety of different things, including what to do with the worn out wind turbines and worn out solar panels when they reach the end of their useful life, but also where do we get the rare earth metals that are essential to their production. You've looked into this a good deal, and just as on the desire to force a rapid reduction in CO2 emissions, developing countries, poor countries, are on the short end of the stick. So also on this, poorer countries are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to the environmental harms that become human harms from the production and the decommissioning of wind and solar apparatus. Can you run that down for us a bit? Give us some examples.
Yeah, much of the rare earth metals which are used for solar and wind comes from China. And China has been infamous for its toxic lakes adjacent to the uh, centers where these toxic rare earth materials, I mean, the metals in themselves might not be toxic, but the process of manufacturing them in a way in which it's usable in wind and solar. That process is very toxic, and the toxic waste is released into the lakes in China. And we have had cases of villages and towns facing serious environmental issues and human hygiene and health problems. So this is an aspect that is mostly disregarded and ignored by the mainstream media. Although we've had a number of media in Europe and US which has brought this to light, and it essentially doesn't get much attention and is conveniently ignored because it does not help the overall climate narrative and the push for renewables. So that is one aspect during the manufacturing stage. When it comes to end of life, we've had numerous instances where the media has been able to grab a picture of the burial of wind turbines in Europe, in Asia, in the US. So this is a big problem. So you literally bury an entire wind turbine because it cannot be dismantled or uh, reprocessed in the way that some of the other things could be. So these are two huge problems during the manufacturing stage and the end of life stage. But even when it comes to the operational stage, still they are not much effective. As I already mentioned, they can give up anytime. They can blackout anytime, uh, forcing the grids that are dependent on them to go into a chaos, and they have to depend on backup like fossil, nuclear, and hydro. So it's not as if these technologies are somehow superior environmentally. Not only are they polluting, they are also not uh, energy friendly when it comes to uh, these technologies are a nightmare to power utilities and to consumers because it increases the price as well. But having said that, I will also like to register this point where, as the field, as a conservationist and as an ecologist who's worked with bird conservation, windmills are notorious for killing birds. They kill birds in millions, and that includes species that are vulnerable, species that are endangered, and especially they have special liking for raptors, birds like the golden eagle, vultures, buzzards, kestrels, and these kind of birds, and even bats. So as a bird conservationist and one who has talked to bird lovers and nature lovers, especially in special conservation zones that are meant to protect birds, they view windmill as a nightmare, and obviously it interferes with the decades-long conservation program aimed at bringing back to life these critical species. And like, I was just baffled when I found out that the US government have killing quotas to wind operators.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, so to say that these are environmental friendly, you have to exclude bird life. And some people push back against this by saying that there are other reasons by which birds die. For instance, domestic cats kill a lot of birds in the US. But here, that logic is very flawed. Just because something is killing birds doesn't mean you can install something that kills more birds. Like, in what way does it help the birds? Like, what do you mean? Are you approving the killing of birds? And especially, uh, cats do not kill raptors. It's very uncommon to see a cat killing a bald eagle or a predatory bird. So
Goes the other
that
way
logic
around.
is, yeah, yeah, yeah. They can easily scoop up a cat for a meal. So the logic is very flawed, and people even say tall buildings kill, but we don't have tall buildings in protected areas across the world where. But the windmills have managed to make their inroads even in these adjacent to these
Yes.
protected areas. So it is a real concern if someone loves nature. Let's say, uh, uh, even if two people agree on ins- the goodness of renewables, but if they are being honest, wind turbines are killers of birds, and that has to come through if a person is honest with himself.
Yeah. Okay, Vijay, we're pretty much about at the end of the program here. I would like for you now to take 2 minutes to say what you wish you could say directly to the delegates to COP26 in Glasgow. If you were there and you were given 2 minutes to say to them what your concerns are as a citizen of India, as well as a climate scientist and an ecologist, what would you say? 2 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. My message to the leaders would be the problem with our understanding of the climate, and it begins with the current crop of climate models, CMIP6, that are being used to forecast the future in IPCC reports. And recent studies have indicated that they exaggerate the warming on Earth with their predictions. This is because there is an uh, o- there has been like undue credentials given to the role of carbon dioxide in increasing global temperatures. So as a result, these models are extra sensitive to any increase in carbon dioxide, and as a result, they forecast warming that is not observed on Earth. We know this through studies stu- that looked at these models and their performance over the past decade, and they were able to ascertain that they are exaggerating the warming. So we have a problem with our understanding of science. Let's not go to the discussion about climate denialism or climate alarmism. Let's just look at the current crop of models. We have a big problem with that. So when you have that, how can you ask countries to take actions for a certain uh, to to achieve a certain uh, level of decrease in global temperatures? That is a problem.
Yeah.
And there's another problem that the number of data points used to measure global temperatures have come down drastically, and most of these temperature points tend to be in urban centers where there's a high urban heat island impact, which makes these temperatures biased towards artificial warming. So that is a problem as well, and more importance should be given to satellite temperature measurements, which give us a more unbiased overview of temperatures on Earth, and it shows that there
Yeah.
has been no dangerous warming. So the very premise has been wrong, and not just that, but this premise is being used unfairly towards developing countries, which are in no stage to give up on fossil fuels. So we have
Right.
300 million poor people in India, and there are a lot of people who are in energy poverty, and even a middle income person like me faces blackouts on an everyday basis. So the developing part of the world is not ready to get on this experimental climate bandwagon. And so and more importantly, the leaders at COP should respect individual nations and their sovereignty to decide their own domestic energy policy, especially when these countries have not faced the impact of climate as it's portrayed to be. For example, India and China's food crop outputs have been extremely high at record levels, and we don't see climate impacting that. And we also do not
Yeah.
see climate bringing us more extreme weather events. So the culmination of all these reasons points to the fact that the COP leaders should not force developing countries into agreeing to their extreme policies.
Very good. Vijay, it's been wonderful talking with you again. And I look forward to the time when we'll get to be together again somehow, whether in India or here in the USA. I have enjoyed our friendship for more than a decade now, and certainly love to watch your growing influence in the media world, in the climate science world. It's been very gratifying to see that happening, and I think that's a very good thing because you are an exceptionally good spokesperson for those who are potentially going to be harmed by, in fact, already are being harmed by the kinds of policies that are coming out of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and now the attempt to get a net zero agreement out of Glasgow. So thank you again very, very much for joining us. It required you to be up very, very early in the morning there in Bengaluru, India. Uh, Glad that you didn't have one of those blackouts in the midst of this that comes so frequently there. People in the developed world should really think hard about whether they want to switch to unreliable energy sources, wind and solar, from the reliable coal and natural gas, nuclear and hydro that provide most of our power now. Again, Vijay, thank you very much. And
Thank
everyone,
you.
thank you for joining us this evening. I want to give you a quick reminder that throughout the month of November, we would be delighted to send you a free copy of the book, Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty by my friend David Fowler. This is a wonderful book that I would urge you to read for yourself and then to pass it on to a member of your state legislature. Just stick it in the mail to that member, to your governor, to the mayor or city council member near you, because frankly, our liberties are being eroded rapidly by a Supreme Court that is no longer really controlled by the Constitution it's supposed to uphold. And David Fowler has outlined a way that state and local officials can fight back and win against the Supreme Court on such rulings. So, if you would like a copy of this, all we ask you to do is to make a donation of literally any size and ask for it. And 100% of your donation will be tax deductible because when you do this, as our way of saying thank you, we'll be glad to send you a free copy of Recovering the Constitution. To request your copy, go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, fill in the when you get to the comments field, write in promo code 21-11 or the book title Recovering the Constitution, and we'll be delighted to send you a copy of that. Our guest next week is well, frankly, I forgot to to put his name on a note here, and it's over in my other room in my study, so I can't tell you at the moment. That's my memory problem. But I assure you that it will be a delightful program, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. Oh, it is David Fowler, author of Recovering the Constitution. So he will be with us next week on From the Stacks. I hope that you will join us then. Thanks again for joining us tonight. God bless you. Have a great week.